So I'm going to kind of talk about three things, as Colin kind of said. I'm going to give you an update on the Trump tracker and an update on some of the implications for Europe, and just end on that report on protecting UK institutions. So um, on tracking Trump, and I kind of said this last time, but it's still true that if it isn't abundantly clear by, I mean, it should be abundantly clear by now that Trump's second term is not politics as usual. It's not a normal Republican government. And and this was true in September. It's even more true now that it really has embraced a populist right-wing authoritarian playbook. I'm just now going to put in some tweets from the Department of Homeland Security and Kristi Noem, who's Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, and they are just such classic fascist imagery, basically. This is from today. Where they've launched a dictionary of depravity, they call it, the worst of the worst, a way of demonizing immigrants. And this is from also from today with this kind of, again, this very nationalistic, secure Americans future kind of imagery and propaganda. There's so much going on. This was something that Kristi Noem wrote on the 1st of December, basically recommending a full travel ban on every damn country that's been flooding our nation with killers, leeches, and entitlement junkies. And I think we all know where language such as leeches can lead. So I've been tracking Trump, tracking the action since January. Basically every day, just trying to make sure that there's some kind of contemporaneous record of what's happened. And I'm now almost 2,000 authoritarian actions of the administration. Now, since September, the site has had an upgrade. We now categorize everything into 10 types of violation, if you like. Any action can fall into more than one, and about half of them do. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's from violating democratic norms through to weakening civil rights, corruption, enrichment, and nationalism. And these little charts just tell you how those numbers have changed over time. Also, in addition, since September, as you can see, we're on 1984. We'll probably hit 2000 on Thursday. Yeah, which isn't great. Uh, this is how it breaks down over time. So the kind of thing basically accelerated a lot over the summer and peaked in September. And October and November were a bit quieter, not hugely quieter, but a bit quieter. But I wonder whether that is because those months coincided with a whole load of stuff and distractions around Epstein, and they were also during the government shutdown. Because certainly December has been really busy and it feels like everything is picking up again. Now, for each action, it comes with a link. If you click on the thing, it takes you to the news story about the action. So that's how it's sourced. It has the date that news story was published, and you can see very quickly what categories it's been put into, and you can filter on any domain. You can search the titles of any action, and you can use this slider to select on dates, and then you can also download any of those, either the full list or filtered list. So the idea is it's there as a resource for people to do their own analysis, to write their own stuff. It's just, in some ways, I almost think it will be most useful after, whenever after is, as a way of saying this is what happened during. And just also highlight that we have this chart of how things break down by month. And basically actions are spread across all the domains. Some of the biggest are undermining democracy here, and nationalism here, and suppressing dissent is a really major one. So Colin actually asked me to kind of think about a couple of these domains, and one of them is corruption, which I think often doesn't get the attention it deserves simply because there's always so much else going on. I have so far logged 148 actions in corruption and enrichment. Is probably I've missed some because they're not always reported. There hasn't really kind of been like this massive escalation. There's just kind of a lot going on all the time. And I was looking at them basically this week and thinking, well, can you categorize these more? And they fall into five main types. So the first is using state powers to financially benefit allies and donors, right? Which is kind of a classic case of corruption. So that's the kinds of things where there's been a lot of deregulating industries that directly benefit donors, particularly the tech industry, the crypto industry, and the oil and gas industry. Things like only approving federal funding for Republican states. So, for instance, FEMA disaster funding was only okayed for Republican states, and he was very open about it. He basically just said, I'm not doing it for Democratic states. And also, there's the kind of preferential awarding of government contracts. So, for instance, to Starlink, to certain media organizations, or trying to think what else. I had it in the tip of my head, but I can't remember it right now. The second one is using state powers to benefit allies and donors politically or legally. So this isn't so much about financial benefit, but it's other types of benefit. So there's been a hell of a lot of pardoning going on. I was actually quite shocked when I was going through this, just how many pardons he has given to donors and allies. Then there's kind of political benefits, such as smoothing the way for donors or allies to immigrate to the US. So, for instance, there's a 5 million Trump visa, $5 million Trump visa. And then also, not if before you can pardon people, you can just stop litigation. So there have been various cases that Biden had started against companies for breach of regulation, and they've just stopped them. Then there's the kind of classic personal and family enrichment. So this is any way that Trump or his family stands to make personal money out of his office. There's some just quite blatant things like Trump buying government bonds, which is corrupt because he has a lot of influence over the value of those bonds through his policies. They have been making loads of deals with crypto firms or overseas real estate, and you really see that one of the ways that foreign governments try to curry favor with the Trump administration, so to get beneficial tariffs or whatever, is by offering sweetheart deals on new golf courses or new hotels. And the Trump family has made billions of dollars this year on their crypto investments. And then just really like in some ways quite pathetic things, but things like he's launched a Trump mobile phone, he's launched a Trump perfume, and he will quite blatantly sell these from the White House or the Oval Office. A kind of slightly more obscure one, but which I still think is really important, is regulatory capture and selective enforcement of the law to the benefit of allies and donors. So, for instance, they ended enforcement of the Corporate Transparency Act, which means that companies can get away with a lot more. They halted the work of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was right in the middle of actually investigating and bringing cases against exploitative tech companies that are now no longer being targeted. And also, there's just been corporate capture in that he has appointed loyalists to some of these key anti-corruption agencies and effectively stopped them doing their work. And the final one that I've put in is personal vanity. So, for instance, he's renamed the Institute of Peace the Trump Institute of Peace. The national parks have now offered free entry on Trump's birthday, but no longer on Martin Luther King Day. And FIFA, awarded Trump its first Peace Prize this week. Now, the reason I put that into corruption is because partly it's a way of currying favor with Trump. And partly I think he uses it as a way to try and pressure organizations to do what he wants. He tries to say, praise me, which in one way is pathetic, but I still think it kind of counts as corruption. And this is how those actions kind of break down. This is that each one is assigned to only one category. And you can see that most of it is these three things. It's financially benefiting allies and donors through using the power of the state to regulate. It's enriching himself, and it's a lot of these pardons are happening here. And then the other type that I wanted just to go through today, because it leads directly into the implications for Europe, is kind of aggressive foreign policy or destabilizing the global world order. And again, I hadn't it was only when I was compiling this talk that I was like, oh God, you know, so much actually has happened here. And I've logged 256 actions since January, and it's the only one that has basically just shot up and up and up as we've been going on. Um, and part of that is the stuff they're doing in Venezuela, which I've been logging meticulously. Um, but also there is just a lot of increasing rhetoric against other liberal democracies and for other populist authoritarian states. So again, I've categorized them into 5 types. There's the use of force and threats of military action. So these are things like bombing Iran. I mean, anyone remember that? It's the kind of the first few months were just full of threats towards Greenland, Panama, Canada, and Gaza. And since September, there's really been this escalation of military action against Venezuela, which most lawyers, and including one of the UN committees, think is breach of international law because there's absolutely no due process or evidence of what these boats are accused of. And then last week, the alleged war crime of the double strike on a boat where they basically took out helpless survivors. Trade wars, sanctions, and economic coercion is a classic example of aggressive foreign policy. He has repeatedly used tariffs or threatened to use tariffs to force countries to fall in with his bidding. He's threatened to cut off aid to countries. So, for instance, he said to Argentina, I will cut off all aid if you don't vote for Milei, who was his ally, is his ally. And they did. And he's also been using sanctions. So he's sanctioned foreign judges. He's sanctioned, for instance, the Brazilian judges who ruled against Bolsonaro. He's sanctioned ICC judges and lawyers. He's sanctioned South Africa for some bizarre reason. And these have consequences. So one of my friends knows some ICC lawyers who've been sanctioned, and he says, you know, they can't access international banking. They can't travel to the US. You know, they can't. They're literally constrained in where they can go and what they can do, and how they can finance themselves. The US has withdrawn from international agreements and it's undermined those kind of institutions wherever it can. So very early on, it withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, it withdrew from the World Health Organization. In the autumn, it didn't send any representative for the very first time to COP30, the big climate change conference. It's undermined the UN Human Rights Council and basically said it's not going to work with it anymore. It's vetoed international agreements on maritime policy and non-communicable diseases, among other things. And it's constantly trying to undermine the EU. It's trying to undermine the EU's right to make its own laws. It doesn't like the tech laws, it doesn't like the environmental laws, and it doesn't like the equality and diversity laws. The fourth one is restrictive immigration, refugee, and humanitarian policy. So it's done travel bans against 19 countries. Those are now very, very severe. And they want to extend it to over 30 countries. It's ended support for various humanitarian efforts, which are thought to be costing or will cost millions of lives over the next decade or so. So that's USAID, it's PEPFAR, which was HIV treatment, and Gavi, which is the International Vaccine Alliance. It's basically ended asylum. Asylum isn't a thing in the US anymore, with the sole exception on if you're a white South African farmer. And even for legal immigration, it's really cracking down. It's making visas a lot more expensive, particularly the skilled worker visa, the H-1B. And it's now, well, as of this week, basically any visa applicant is going to be vetted for any social media activity against the regime. But even if them or any family member has ever worked in the field of misinformation or contact check or fact checking or content moderation, you're not getting in. And the final one is kind of this real move towards aligning with authoritarian regimes and kind of undermining democratic norms. Like Trump doesn't like liberal democracies and he doesn't like freely elected leaders. He has consistently supported Russia over Ukraine ever since January. He's made official policy now, as of last week, to promote far-right populist movements across Europe. That's what he says the future of Europe should be. And he's also been interfering in other countries' elections and judicial processes. He's repeatedly called, say, for Bolsonaro to be released. He's called for Benjamin Netanyahu to be pardoned and all of this stuff. he doesn't respect other countries' right to rule themselves. And this is how those break down. And you can see the largest one here is the use of force or the threats of military action. And then the kind of restricted immigration, refugee, and humanitarian policies, which really comes directly from the nationalist agenda. And I think, as we all know, he's been very keen on trade wars and sanctions, and basically using the economic might of America to force the world to do its bidding, in which he's been reasonably successful. I hate to say, but he has. And one of these types is not like the others. So what I also did is just plotted how those 5 types changed over time. And you can see one has just been massively increasing, and that's this militarization, use of force, and threats of military action, which is really driven by what's been going on in Venezuela. And he is now threatening to start a land war in Venezuela. I think initially probably he'll be taking out land targets with bombs, but who knows where that's going to go. And he's also now threatening to do that to any other country. He said this week, if they, by which he means drugs, come in through any country, or if we think people are building mills or fentanyl or cocaine, anybody doing that or selling it into our country is subject to attack, not just Venezuela. It also appears that he only just heard that Colombia makes cocaine. Venezuela is not a drug-producing country. Very little of the drugs in the US come from Venezuela, and hardly any of the fentanyl. But that doesn't stop them, and people really think it's about the oil, because Venezuela is one of the biggest oil rivals to the US. So what are some of the implications for Europe? So this is what I said in September. I'm just going to remind people, and obviously not everyone was there, but it has big implications for defense and security. It's completely undermining NATO. I can't imagine. Well, basically, I think if anyone thinks that the US is going to respect Article 5 of NATO, I think they're dreaming. And obviously, that includes threats against Greenland, which is in NATO, removing support from Ukraine, and really forcing a Putin-backed peace plan. Then, of course, there's the right-wing populist aspect, where he consistently attacks European freedoms and supports a right-wing populist nationalism. And there's the economic consequences. There's tariffs, there's retaliation. And particularly, you can see that it's affected UK trade policy and how we have to constantly worry about, what the tariff's going to mean, and it basically silences our leaders. And then there are massive health implications for global health, and that's only going to get worse. And he certainly, like, as an aside, the attacks on vaccines in the US will be undermining vaccine confidence globally. So I basically said, I think back in September, I said we have to understand that the US is no longer a protector; it's become a threat to the US, to Europe, and this is what's happened since September. So there have been a lot more attacks on the lack of free speech in Europe. And all I want to say, well, I mean, you can have your own opinions on free speech in Europe, but I think Timothy Schneider or Stephen Levitsky, I can't remember who, said one really simple test to tell if you're in an authoritarian regime is whether you can oppose the government without consequence. I think it's pretty clear that you cannot do that in the US. If you criticize the administration and publicly criticize the administration, you will be punished, whether it's through rescinding your visa, deportation, Trump attacking you on Twitter, taking out lawsuits against you, whatever it happens to be, there are consequences. So I would argue that if anyone has to worry about free speech, it's in the US. The administration hosted Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right German party, in the White House this autumn. The US has now backed a Ukrainian peace plan that's entirely on Russia's terms. They did not involve either Europe or Ukraine in putting it together. It demanded that the EU reverse its climate and human rights rules to allow for greater imports of liquefied natural gas. Trump publicly questioned the purpose of the UN. This was in the UN Assembly in the autumn, and told European countries they were going to hell. Marco Rubio has ordered diplomats in Europe to basically argue for their host governments to restrict immigration. And he's told them to file reports back to the US if governments appear overly supportive of immigrants. And then last week, Trump, the administration issued like an official national security strategy paper, which was the first for a while. And basically that indicated the US would no longer guarantee Europe's security. It also accused the EU of stifling political liberty, warned that NATO members risk becoming majority non-European. And the only way you can read majority non-European is majority non-white. And said that the US should align with patriotic European parties, which is clearly the far-right populist parties. And then it goes on to say that the US interest will be served by promoting those parties to victory in each state. That is the policy of the US, right? It is to promote far-right nationalism across Europe. And this is just headlines from today. So today, Trump said Europe was decaying and we had weak leaders. The US is no ally to Europe. It's like there is just no clearer way of saying it is not our ally. So the final bit of the talk is just not that many slides. Just I want to talk about kind of protecting UK institutions. So I'm just going to start with Timothy Schneider, who is a world-leading academic on authoritarian regimes, and he publishes Substack saying here are 20 things on lessons on tyranny, which he published on January 20th this year. The first one was do not obey in advance. Unfortunately, in the US, we are seeing people obeying in advance. I think you could argue that in Europe, you're seeing that as well among some countries. But the second one was defend institutions. And he says, you know, it is institutions that help us preserve decency. And then it says, institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. And we have seen that. We have seen that up close and personal in the US since January. Trump has captured, closed, undermined, defunded institution after institution, particularly ones that are there to protect Americans, whether that's public health, whether it's the CDC, the FDA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Consumer Bureau Protection Agency. He has captured and undermined them all. He's taken over the FBI. He's undermining law and order. And I think I was certainly just quite shocked by how quickly he did it. He's kind of brought the universities to heel as well. And so what I wanted to do was understand, you know, is that something that was unique to the US or are we vulnerable here in the UK? And we did this report where we looked at the key kind of scientific and evidence-making independent bodies in the UK and mapped their vulnerabilities. And that report was released in October this year, so just a couple of months ago. And essentially what we found is that we are just as vulnerable, if not more vulnerable, than the US if there was a government that came in that was determined to undermine the function of these agencies. And really what's kind of protected them is that governments have generally, to more or less extent, accepted that they perform an important function and that function is mostly independent. Now, it isn't always, and there have been constant pushes at the boundaries, and you've seen it most recently with the BBC. But in general, that's kind of been a consensus that's held. But it is a consensus, right? It's not protected in law. And I'm just going to show you some examples of what we found. So we looked at 24 bodies in detail, but I'm going to show you about the results for these 8. So these are all high profile, arm's length bodies that do crucial things. Most people wouldn't know that necessarily that it's an arm's length body. So you've got things like the ones that produce the national evidence, the national data on how a country is doing, the Office for National Statistics. You've got the ones that mark the government's homework on spending, even if they manage to leak important results in the Office for Budget Responsibility. But then you've got things like the Met Office, which is our national weather forecaster, but also like one of the international um, climate change research agencies. It has one of the world's best and most powerful supercomputers and contributes to the International Panel on Climate Change every few years. It is so important in that space. You've got the Food Standards Agency and the Medicines and Health Regulation Agencies, which make sure that our medicines and our foods are safe. You've got Natural England for the environment and Health Security Agency for our public health. And then UKRI, which is all about, that's the government funder for science and innovation that decides, almost, where our economy goes, but generating the evidence for future policy. And so really they're kind of examples of bodies that provide expertise or key sector regulation, and they help hold government to account. And really their independence kind of underpins public trust, evidence-based policy, and I would say democratic accountability. And we identified kind of 6 domains of potential vulnerability across all of these bodies. And it's really true for pretty much all arm's length bodies. These are the big tests, are you free to publish, or are you potentially censored by your minister? Do you have a statutory basis? So any parliament has sovereignty, any parliament can abolish agencies, but ones that have a statutory basis can only be abolished through an act of parliament. And that forces, firstly, some months of consideration. And secondly, it forces it to be in public and for there to be a public debate about what's happening. If there's no statutory basis, you can do things much more quickly and also under cover of night, if you like. Secure funding, and we've seen that over and over again in the US. It's no use existing if you have no money with which to do your job. Who gets to set your priorities is really important. Obviously, government can set overall strategy, but how much micromanaging is there in your priorities? And for instance, a Lord Select Committee already said that they felt that the UKRI, the research funding, is too micromanaged by government, and it doesn't get to have independence in that way. Accountability. So who are you accountable to? If you're accountable directly to Parliament, you have the most independence. If you are only accountable to Parliament through your minister, then actually there's potential for the message to get massaged, if you like. And finally, leadership is a really important one. Who appoints your leadership? And again, we've seen that in the US, that you can completely subvert the function of an agency by having a loyalist or an ideologue in power. And we've seen that, like Robert, RFK Jr. in health is basically him and the people that he's appointed who believe as he do are now massively restricting access to childhood vaccines in the US. So this is what this looks like in the UK. You can see it's a really varied picture. If it's green, it means they have that freedom. If it's orange, it means they don't. So you can see that some agencies like the Office for National Statistics actually have a lot of independence built into how they function. And some have barely any. So the UK's Health Security Agency is free to publish, but in anything else, it basically sits entirely within the Department of Health, and it has no separate existence. And it could be abolished tomorrow, just like Public Health England was abolished, which was its predecessor pretty much overnight during the pandemic. And what you can also see is that actually leadership is one where almost all of the bodies that we looked at had leadership appointed directly by the minister. So what happens is that at the moment, for most of these bodies, that you have an independent panel that shortlist, that basically suggests the remit of the role and then shortlist. The minister has input into that shortlist. And then the panel recommends, right, here are like 3 people that we think can do the job, and the minister would pick. And that's normally what happens. And then you end up with a perfectly good person doing it. But the minister has the right to override that panel. Now they can do 2 things. They can either say, no, I don't like any of these people, I want you to rerun the process. Or they can say, no, I'm going to just appoint someone else, and I don't care if you consider them unappointable. And that is allowed. If they do that, they do have to tell Parliament why they're doing it, but they're allowed to do it. And you most recently saw this all play out when Boris Johnson tried to put Paul Dacre in at the head of Ofcom. And he reran that process twice because the panel kept not appointing Paul Dacre, and eventually Paul Dacre just said, "Look, I'm out." Um, but so it has happened. And as I kind of said, like you can get away with these kind of vulnerabilities when no one is actively trying to exploit them. And you can just not think it's a big issue. But if you wait to fix them once they are being exploited, you've waited too long. And I think again, the US is the kind of exemplar of this. And so we came up with 7 recommendations. Um, and I'm just going to just go through them quickly. So the first one is actually for some key bodies that are really important for public health and environment. We should have legal and statutory protections for those bodies. And it just means that if a new government did want to abolish them, it would at least have to do it in public and openly. I think there is a strong argument for limiting the direct ministerial involvement in leadership appointments. You can certainly get ministerial input, and it should be someone the minister can work with, but really they should be independent appointments and they should have a minimum level of expertise required to do the job. This is a really difficult one in that at the moment a lot of these bodies are funded through these annual grant in aid packages, which are which can be very changeable and can be rapidly removed, which should basically cripple an agency. If you move toward a multi-year funding model, it gives those agencies much more security and ability to do forward planning and strategic planning. It's obviously difficult to do in our current economic circumstances. But what you could do, for instance, is you could say, look, if you're proposing to cut funding for an agency by more than, I don't know, 25%, then there has to be a debate about it in Parliament, or it has to get looked at by a select committee or the National Audit Office or something. So there's some kind of oversight and scrutiny towards any attempt to absolutely slash the funding for these bodies. I think we need to strengthen direct accountability to Parliament, but also to the public. I think if we're going to strengthen the independence of these bodies, you have to make sure they are accountable, and that you can hold them to account for poor performance. I think there has to be some kind of safeguard for operational autonomy and priority setting, which is based on evidence and science that lies within the government's strategic priorities, sure, but isn't micromanaged. And I think there has to be the right to publish findings without political interference. And finally, just to foster a culture that values and defends these institutions. So for so long, pretty much all political parties have kind of indulged in this easy rhetoric against them. They're quangos, they're unaccountable, they're undemocratic, they're just full of bureaucrats and unaccountable elites, without defending the really important functions that they perform. And I think we forget that, one of the reasons that we have far less food poisoning in the UK than the US is because we have much stronger regulation and standards around our foods. The fact that, the kind of terrible fires that used to regularly sweep through London all the way through the kind of the 19th century have largely disappeared from the capital because we regulated building and made it safer. Like these things have given us a better quality of life because they have used evidence and science to make things better. And just kind of, this is the last slide, just on where we are with the report since it was published. So it has started to gain traction. So the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which is a select committee in the House of Commons, has requested copies of the report. So I'm delivering that next week. I'm just getting it printed. We're holding a roundtable for civil society organisations and institutional leads in January, hosted by the Institute for Government. So we're just currently planning that agenda, but we've got some really good attendees coming. Various MPs and peers have expressed interest, and it's great that they've kind of reached out to me as opposed to me reaching out to them. And we're currently arranging an event for parliamentarians in early March that should be held in Westminster. We've got an MP who's willing to sponsor it. So that would be, I think, a really kind of exciting opportunity. And then the kind of Charities Centre About Science holding a roundtable on this kind of topic in late March. And that's going to be a kind of a different focus, and it's going to be about how can these institutions and bodies that kind of support their function make the public case for their role and their independence? How can we effectively explain what they do and why what they do matters? And then finally, there's been some international interest as well. So the British Council have said they're interested, and I'm going to be talking about this at a joint UK, I should say UK German event in Berlin in February, because the Germans are also worried about this. They've got local elections coming up, and it's kind of it's certainly a topic which isn't just about the UK, right? I think pretty much all democracies have got their eye on what's coming down the line in the next elections. And that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing. I haven't really got that much to say about the European response because I haven't followed it this week. But
Yeah.
I did see today that someone asked Keir Starmer about what Trump said today about, these decaying countries and their weak leaders, and he said nothing. Like, he was weak. He just said, "Oh well," and hedged his
Mm.
bets. And he, like, Starmer's been someone who's been very, very unwilling to make a strong case for UK's democracy. Oh, I know what he said. He said we're taking control of our borders. And I'm like, no, like just by saying that, you're legitimizing the whole attack based on immigration, which just isn't our biggest problem. It just isn't. Our biggest problem is what's going on over in the US. And while I might not expect Trump to say that, I think there's this kind of, I'm not sure how maintaining this fiction that the US is this strong ally is helping anyone. I don't see how it
Mm.
helps
Mm.
because it's not true. I don't know if the US would ever intervene directly, and maybe it doesn't need to as long as Russia does it. But what you do have in the US is some of the world's richest men who are aligned with that vision. Musk is just one of them, but there are others.
Mm.
And if Musk starts pouring his millions into, he already tried, right? But pouring his
Mm.
millions into
Mm.
UK elections or German
Mm.
elections or French elections, then that could be enough to destabilize things because we don't have that. We don't have American levels of political spending in these countries. The best hope for the UK is that Musk seems to think Farage is too soft and really wants Tommy Robinson to do it, and I think he's on a hiding to nothing there and does not understand that. But it is quite scary to me. If this was the 1930s, the equivalent would be an American government who openly is supporting Hitler and Mussolini and so forth, and talking about immigrants in exactly the same kind of language that they used in the
Yes.
1930s. That's where we are. Well, I think he does up until the point where he thinks the US can manufacture its own chips. And he's trying very hard to make that happen as quickly as he can. Um, but I don't think he has any. I don't think he has any interest beyond the economic. Um,
No.
but at the moment, I think he still needs it, or the US still needs Taiwan. So I think he would, but I don't know if I don't know. He might think he could do a deal with China. So I think what's interesting, well, with reform, they have said they're going to do a Doge, which is basically hollowing out the state. So there is no doubt in my mind that reform are coming for our arms length bodies. I
Mm.
think reform are going to try and undermine our free media. I think they'll try and undermine the BBC. I think they'll try undermine Ofcom and promote having more state media channels like Fox, but hit GB News or whatever it happens to be. I think they will go down that way, and I think they will consider politicizing the judiciary. And the Tories have talked about that as well, right? I think if you listen to the right, the far right of the Tory party, they're having exactly the same conversations about our activist judges, our activist lawyers, and that I find quite scary. I um I think we need to worry about the environment. I think there is less of a kind of crazy health agenda with them. Um, and but I don't know what's going to happen in terms of civil rights. I mean, obviously both Reform and the Tories want to leave the EHRC. EHCR, which way? Which way is it? The European Human Rights, which one's that? EHRC, right? Yeah. and and they both are constantly attacking wokeness. And we can, so one of the things in the US is they have consistently undermined protections for minorities. And I think that would happen here. I think you would see more clampdown on the right to protest, which is already happening. I mean, Labour are going for it, the Tories went for it. So I don't know. But I would like to think that Nigel Farage has more respect for democracy as an institution than Trump. But I don't know that.
So
Well, I've actually been writing a Substack on this very topic for about months and just have never managed to finish it, but I will finish it at some point. I've just always got these deadlines that mean my Substack writing has kind of got much less, but there are various things I want to write about. But this is one of them. So I do think there will be elections, definitely midterms, probably presidential. What I don't think is that there will be free or fair. And you already have seen a lot of actions aimed at reducing the franchise, right? Removing birthright citizenship, forcing a lot more ID laws as to who can vote, forcing people to re-register whenever they move, and all of this stuff that basically makes it harder for people to vote. I have no doubt that they will be putting ICE agents at polling stations to deter voters. And it won't just deter, I mean, obviously non-citizens can't vote, but effectively, if you're brown, are you going to risk being picked up? And that is basically kind of the way the ICE seems to pick people up, right? How foreign do you look? And they're already doing things like, like if they restrict mail-in voting, if they're already starting to sow doubt in election processes, to sow doubt about close elections. The official position of the US government is that Trump won in 2020. They've now started an official investigation into Venezuela rigging the 2020 election for Biden. So they're starting all of these stories that they can use to undermine the next election if they lose. So what they're going to do is they're going to try and tilt the playing field to make it very hard for the Democrats to win. And if the Democrats do still win by mobilizing people, they've then laid the field for them to bring lawsuits and doubt and claim that they won. I mean, Trump likes to talk about rigging elections all the time already. He's now in a position to kind of make that a reality. And he's got a much tamer Supreme Court now than there was in 2020. So in that sense, I think it will be very hard for the Republicans to lose. I think if they lose in the midterms, that will be the easiest one for them to lose. Trump isn't on the ballot. And it's possible that Democrats will be able to mobilize enough people. And you have seen this kind of arms race in gerrymandering your districts, which between the Democrats and the Republicans to kind of go, how many seats can we get? I mean, it's deeply undemocratic, but that's what they're doing. If the Democrats manage to win the midterms and win the House, it means they can stop legislation. It means they can investigate, and it means they can release documents. And that will have a really big impact on what Trump could do. If they lose, I think we're screwed. So I think next November is the real test. But what worries me is that we're 11 months in. I think where we are now was not imagined. Well, I don't think we'd imagined that in January. I don't even think we imagined it in May. The administration is getting bolder and bolder and more white supremacist. And now it's normalized putting military in the cities, particularly democratic cities. It's normalized dissent. It's normalized deporting people, imprisoning people without due process. And where are we going to be in another year? And that's what scares me. There are loads of polling trackers, like, most of the big newspapers run one, all these different websites, like 538 would run one, like they're everywhere. I would just say about the polls is the polls don't matter
No.
if you rig the election, well, don't rig the election, if you bias the election. And I think what people don't quite appreciate and the pollsters can't really compensate for is that there is just this alternate information space in the US, and you have Fox News and the right-wing podcast bros who have millions and millions and millions of followers, particularly among younger men, just pumping out disinformation all the time. And I think what you've seen with Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and actually if Elon Musk's aim was to create a right-wing information space, then it was worth the money for him, because he is radicalizing so many thousands of people all the time on X. And I think you're seeing that in our politicians here, the kinds of language and rhetoric that's become normalized through X is really scary. I think you can see it in like Robert Jenrick, if you see his journey, or Kemi Badenoch, or even some Labour politicians, the way we think about immigration and immigrants and race is just quite frightening. And I don't think we can kind of overestimate the importance of the fact that the media in the US is pretty much a right-wing ecosphere. And he's about to, okay, I'm just going to say, so this week, news came out that Netflix has won the bid to take over Warner Brothers.
Oh.
Trump said yesterday, I'm going to have a say in that. It's a really big market share, blah, blah, blah. It's my duty to check whether it should happen or not. Now, that is kind of normal state practice for these kinds of antitrust violations. However, it then turned out that a few hours later, Paramount launched a hostile bid for Warner Brothers. Now, Paramount is owned by the son of Trump's biggest donor, David Ellison, who is a billionaire. The other person involved in that bid is Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. And then today, the Wall Street Journal reported that as part of this bid, Paramount promised Trump that they would control CNN, who's owned by Warner Brothers and who Trump hates. So they're amalgamating control of these formerly independent news outlets, just like Bezos did with getting the Washington Post. And there aren't many independent ones left. It's depressing. So one of the things we have to protect in the UK is our free media, but that isn't from what free media there is left. I mean, Byline Times is obviously a prime example of that, which operates on a shoestring of the budget of some of the others. It's devastating. Various people I know out there have lost their jobs, they've lost their funding. I was on a panel actually last week with various US scientists who'd worked at NIH or worked at the CDC or worked in university research groups, and they said people in the US just do not understand quite how destroyed it is. Like, it's not something. If in 2028 a Democrat president was elected, it wouldn't go back to normal. Like, you have lost a decade of science in the US already, because people's careers have been cut short and new people aren't coming. So you're not training people, you're not doing that research. And would you trust, like, if you're interested in studying vaccines or interested in studying public health or the social determinants of health or climate change or misinformation, if your funding is going to flip-flop every 4 years, why would you do it? You don't go into it. And it's just that slow silencing of the generation of knowledge. And the rest of the world just cannot match the funding that the US used to put into it. Like they cancelled $800 million of funding into a Moderna mRNA cancer vaccine.
I believe that the Chinese and the Indians are trying to take up as many people as they can from the science groups.
Yeah, but I mean, so someone's just written expecting an influx of US scientists. There are US scientists wanting to come, but we pay a quarter of what you get paid in the US. And UK universities are not in a position to hire loads of people. Our universities are about to go bankrupt.
Yes.
So, and it's not like the EU universities are any better off either. So there are some schemes. Yes, some scientists are coming, but firstly, not everyone can. Their partners or their children or their parents or their lives are in the US. They just change fields. They leave their jobs. They do something else. They're highly qualified, intelligent people. Um, and then the ones that, there's someone who's desperate to come to the UK or to Europe in general. He studies misinformation. He's like, I can't do my job I can't do my job in America. But there aren't that many jobs here. I mean, I think it's a massive opportunity for the UK to poach some of the world's brightest minds, but it's hard to do. And there's no money for it. I mean,
Yes.
literally in the budget, the UK just put an additional fee on foreign students.
Still.
No, I mean, like blatantly, I mean, like the constant rhetoric was that it was a democratic shutdown. They broke the Hatch. So there's an act of law in America called the Hatch Act, which basically says that the federal government is not allowed to take partisan positions. So if there's a shutdown, the federal government is not allowed to blame it on one party or the other. They broke that repeatedly. They had ads in airports saying your plane is delayed because of the Democrats. They forced the agencies out of office to say this is a shutdown caused by the Democrats. I mean, they broke the law. No one's holding them to account for it. So yes, they are. The other week he called Ilhan Omar, who's a Democratic congresswoman from Minnesota. He called her garbage. So she's garbage. He constantly attacks people like that. Stephen Miller, who's his kind of top aide and is a massive white supremacist, has basically said that the Democrats are a domestic terrorist organization. And what I think people have to be really careful of is that the US is currently passing lots of laws around, or the FBI is currently targeting Antifa, so anti-fascist movements. They've classified that as a domestic terrorist movement and are now trying to crack down on Antifa organizations. Now, Antifa isn't an organization, but they're saying and allied organizations, and they're thinking it's a way of starting to attack some of the big NGOs that have been holding the government to account so far by taking them to court over, say, labor laws and stuff. So that's like the ACLU, or trade unions and those kinds of organizations. Now, they can target those, they can take away their tax exempt status, they can embroil them in lawsuits. If they start designating Democrat-aligned organizations like, say, Vote Blue, which is a fundraiser for the Democrats, or some of the women's organizations that are trying to promote female candidates in the Democrats, if they start targeting those and start labeling them with this extremist tag, then they can start really cracking down on any kind of dissent, and just make it very difficult for them to operate. And they are 100% going for that. Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that they're doing that. So I think there is, and there are in the US, there are organizations. There's a brilliant organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists that I've been talking to as well, that have tens of thousands of members. You have the American Public Health Association, which is really one of the few bodies in the US which has really stood up to the administration. It's led by this amazing guy, George Benjamin. He's like this really charismatic African American truth talker, and he's very open. He says, I'm close to retirement. I've been leading this organization for years, and I'm not going to stand for it. But a lot of organizations are not doing that. But you are now, you're seeing ex-members, ex-heads under both administrations of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, have called out the administration for their restrictions on vaccines and said it's endangering public health. You've had ex-directors of the CDC saying the same thing. So you are now starting to see that happening. And you're seeing the individual states are not following the CDC vaccine guidance anymore. You're seeing that the American Association of Pediatrics has said, no, we think you should still vaccinate newborns for hepatitis B and stuff. So you're seeing that happen in the US. What I think is dangerous is that always disinformation has been a problem for a long time, but it's never quite been this, or not for many years, this state disinformation. That it's the .gov websites that are pumping it out. And CDC used to be the gold standard. And so at some point you have to say, well, you could have trusted it 3 years ago, but you can't trust it now. It's a really confusing message to give to people.
Yes.
And when then the alternative to that disinformation is spread out among different organizations and different associations and different groups, then how do you know who to trust? And that is the danger. It's not that there isn't that information, it's that if you're just a bog standard person, how do you know? You don't know that this organization is any more trustworthy than this one, or that these are the right people, unless you actually know who those people are and you're in the field. And that is the problem. Well, I mean, the WHO and the European CDC equivalent, they've got their own bits of information and they're still evidence-based. So they are somewhere to go. It is true that the US has quite different, it does have more vaccines than you have, say, in Europe for children, but it's partly because it doesn't have a universal healthcare system. And so it's one way of protecting public health when you don't have free treatment or free screening or good access to care. So that's one of the and they have a much higher rates of hepatitis in the US than they do in the UK. So we don't offer hepatitis B because it's not routinely, because it's not a big health issue here. But we do for vulnerable populations. But so it's this kind of so the US is using that quite cleverly and saying, oh look, we want to be the same as this country with this amazing universal healthcare system. We want to be the same as Denmark. And but you don't have the same country as Denmark and the same demographics as Denmark, and so that's not appropriate.